Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. It is Friday, TGIF at 10:22. Beautiful day today. The weather has actually been pretty awesome. Super warm yesterday, and I think it's supposed to be really nice the rest of the weekend. So pretty sweet, pretty awesome time. I hope everyone's doing good. Hope everyone's got some fun plans for the weekend. There's a possibility, and I'm kind of leaning towards wanting to do it. I definitely want to do it, but a couple other things might uh, be happening instead, but we'll see. But the classic, one of the greatest horror movies ever, Suspiria, directed by the legendary Dario Argento, is playing tonight at the Waldo Theater. It's part of the Waldo After Dark series, and a horror masterpiece. One of the greatest Italian horror movies. One of the greatest Italian movies. One of the greatest horror movies in general. It's a movie that I've talked a lot about. I just recently bought. I've seen that movie so many times. It's one of my favorites, and I just recently bought it on Blu-ray. A really amazing edition of it, and I think it's one of those essential movies. Like, if you say you're into horror, and if you're not a fan of like the Friday 13th movies or Halloween, at least those, then maybe you're not really a horror fan, or Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Um, those movies are the most probably, it's safe to say those movies are like the most popular in the whole genre. The you have Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you have of course Friday 13th, the franchise itself, or just the first movie, the John Carpenter's Halloween, the franchise also that's included. I also feel that right up there would be Suspiria. Suspiria is one of those movies too that people who are not necessarily into the horror exploitation world, as far as where that movie came out of, or they might not be say very familiar with it, or no, or they're not aware at all of all of the incredible Italian directors and all of the incredible movies that came out in the 70s and 80s and even 60s that came out of Italy and throughout Europe. That movie is definitely, I would say, commercially is the most popular in that entire genre. That so I think people who are into they're generally into slasher horror films, and they're not very steeped in or very familiar with Italian or European horror. They all know that movie. I think that movie was so widely embraced by critics, but then by fans. It's definitely the biggest. I would have to say probably the most popular Italian horror movie of all time. And with all the acclaim that film has gotten, it rightfully it deserves it, because it is a an amazing film. I love so many films in the Italian genre. Lucio Fulci being my favorite Italian director, but and some people, I watched a podcast yesterday about you know fans. It was about this very same thing, and one of the guy was saying, he talked about Suspiria, and he's like, well, you have some people that when it comes to Italian horror or whatnot, all they know of is Suspiria, and that's all that they'll watch. And he's like, well, you can watch Suspiria, basically till you're blue in the face, and it's great, and it's a classic. And there is something to be said about that. I think it is, it's kind of like, I think sometimes when people refer to, the movie that started the slasher genre, uh, when people talk about Halloween being like that started the slasher genre, like that's, I love that movie to death. I think it's just an amazing classic, and I recently just bought that finally on Blu-ray, or just an amazing edition, and that's one of my all-time favorite horror movies. But it's I've taken a lot of time into checking out the horror genre, the exploitation genre, independent films, and kind of the lineage. And that movie is not at all, not even close, really, to being the first slasher movie. there's so many movies that came before it, and there's also one of the biggest ones, if not the biggest one, that really served as the blueprint for the slasher genre is probably Black Christmas. But that is no that by saying that, by no means am I knocking Halloween because that is a unparalleled classic. But I think I think I think it's people can like what they like, but I think it's if you're a fan of the genre, and it's a massive genre and it spans decades, I think if you're a fan, it really is beneficial just as being a fan and being exposed to kind of the lineage to how this whole beloved genre of ours came to fruition. So tracing it back, going back before 1979, and tracing it back decades before even, and seeing where a lot of this cool stuff originated. One of the biggest person, probably the biggest figure in the world of horror, where gore was introduced, I would say Herschel Gordon Lewis is one probably the guy. He was the first one. I thought for a long time that maybe the Italians were the first ones to originate gore and copious amounts of violence and gore on the big screen practical effects. Because I realized that American slasher films did that obviously, and there's tons of that, but they were not really the originators. And I thought, okay, maybe it was the Italians who did that, which in some ways that's true. But then I traced it back even further, and I realized no, Herschel Gordon Lewis is actually the Godfather. He's referenced as the Godfather of gore. So it's just that whole kind of thing that I think is so cool, and you can trace it back and find movies that even came before Herschel Gordon Lewis or certain directors, and there's a whole slew, just the slasher genre alone. There's a whole ton of movies that came out before Halloween that are just amazing, that predated um, Halloween, and but at the end of the day, that this is not to be taken in any way knocking the importance of Halloween. I think Halloween is a landmark in terms of it was, although it's not the first slasher movie, it is definitely the first movie that I'm aware of that is the first fully like independent horror film, and it's definitely a slasher movie that made uh, like a lot of money, and or that put the slasher in kind of a commercial light. And suddenly it was all of a sudden kind of taken more seriously by Hollywood studios, and it spawned this mega thing, and it was the first of its time, the first independent movie to make that much money at that time. It wasn't initially a big huge success, but over time it did make quite a bit, and it set records, and it was a landmark movie for being one of the first independent films to really be a massive game changer, financially and all these things. So it, without a doubt, you know, Halloween, with everything I just said, is still one of the most important movies in horror, I think. So, but today's show is on a movie, and also it's actually a TV series for Netflix. And again, as most people know, and I talk about it a lot, I just did a big show the other day about streaming and how Best Buy just announced that they are basically eradicating all physical media from their shop. And that's all due to, streaming services and the competition around it. So I've talked a lot about that whole thing, and I've addressed it. And in my own personal habits, I don't stream movies at all. But I do. Occasionally I'll be over a friend's house, or you know, that's usually, if I watch a movie streaming, it's always because, I will, be over a friend's house or a random situation, and I'll watch a movie that way. But at home, I never do. So last night I was over a buddy's house, my friend Emmett Layler, who was actually a guest on Film Fanatic, and way back when we did a whole show that was focused on horror, but the main thing was about Stephen King, and it was a really cool show. It was a huge show. We had thousands and thousands of people checking out that show. It was pretty nuts. But it was a really cool show, and he's great. He's super knowledgeable about horror, and especially all things Stephen King. But we watched last night the new Mike Flanagan series, and it's a Netflix original, and it's basically a retelling or reimagining, if you will, the fall of the fall of the House of Usher, based on Edgar Allan Poe, of course. And I guess there's a whole series of movies that are coming out that Mike Flanagan is doing for Netflix that are somewhat based on Edgar Allan Poe's work. So, and of course, this is there's many versions of his films, most notably Roger Corman, and starring Vincent Price. There's been subsequent other remakes of his work also. My favorite adaptation of all time of and again, I've talked about Edgar Allan Poe. He was the figure, the literary figure, who that's how I got into horror. Like, before I had seen any horror films, I was a kid. I think I was a freshman in high school, or maybe even a little bit younger. And a class I had an English class. I was in an English class, and we were doing, it was like our introduction to, drama and historical stories, and also fiction, nonfiction. And in that class, we kind of had a choice, I remember, of different writers that we could like read about, or pick a writer basically, and pick a couple of their books, and then we have to do like a little report, like a book report on it. And I remember we had these choices, and I ended up, not without knowing who he was or anything about it, I picked Edgar Allan Poe, and that was what started, and that got me addicted to horror. That was like the single. That's what did it for me, and I remain such a huge Edgar Allan Poe. So I'm always excited when there's some kind of new rendition or interpretation of his work, because it's just incredible. Between Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft, who are my two favorite kind of writers in horror. Those I do, and I also actually really like. I do like some Stephen King. I also like quite a bit some of Clive Barker's work. Those are like the writers I can think of off the top of my head that I love. But Edgar Allan Poe is without a doubt my favorite, and I have all of his work, and I have books of his poetry, and just amazing stuff. And I'm a huge. The other thing too, my favorite Edgar Allan Poe adaptation is The Mask of the Red Death, which was directed by Roger Corman, and I think that movie is a masterpiece. I picked that movie up about 2 years ago on Blu-ray, and I just think that movie is such a masterpiece. It's just amazing. I think it's the best movie that, for my money. And there's so many great adaptations of Poe stories by Roger Corman. He did all of the legendary work, and he he's always been one of my favorite figures in the world of horror and horror exploitation. And of course, Vincent Price, iconic. The Mask of the Red Death is just my favorite. It's my favorite Corman movie. It's my favorite Price role also. I bought that about 2 years ago on Blu-ray, and it's one of my most prized possessions. The quality is just amazing. The special features, I mean, it's just immaculate. But there's so many great ones. There are so many other ones that are equally, in a lot of ways, just as good. But I was excited to see when I heard about this series. Again, I don't do streaming, but I'm a huge Mike Flanagan fan. I think he is one of the most creative and one of the best directors in the world of modern horror. So he's done lately. He has done quite a few TV shows. The Haunting of Hill House, which I haven't seen. Midnight Mass, I have not seen. The Haunting by Eighth. The Haunting of Bly Manor, which I haven't seen. The Midnight Club, also. I'm more familiar with his movies. The last movie of his that I saw, and it was I believe the last film that he directed that was a theatrical film, was Doctor Sleep, which is an awesome movie, and I did a show on that recently. But pretty amazing figure in the world of horror. Oculus is an amazing film. That was the first of his films that I saw. A movie that I really want to see, which I still have not seen, which I heard is just amazing, is a movie he did, which is, I guess, a slasher movie called Hush. I haven't seen that one. Ouija, The Origin of Evil, which is a really, really awesome movie. Just a fabulous. I've seen about three or four of his films, and again, I think he is one of the most. I think he's a risk taker. I think he kind of reinvents the wheel, if you will. Has a lot of depth to his work, and generally really knows how to turn on the frights. He generally knows how to churn out a really good original horror film. So I was really excited to see like what he could do with this series, and it just came out, I guess, on Netflix, and I watched it last night, or rewatched it last night, and I thoroughly enjoyed this. I thought it was awesome. Again, it sticks with how Mike Flanagan is, where, and it's an interesting way the way the story is told, because it's essentially it is the fall of the House of Usher, which is a classic Poe story. But the interesting thing that Flanagan does with the story is that he blends in other stories of Poe and kind of sprinkles them in. Some are kind of subtle, some are pretty overt. The one that I was blown away by was his newer version of The Mask of the Red Death, which is so awesome and so badass. And I wasn't sure. It was really interesting, and it's seamless how he's able to. The heart of it is the fall of the House of Usher. That's the main kind of heartbeat of the story. But the way he's able to weave in other tales of Poe, especially The Mask of the Red Death, I just thought was pretty amazing, and it was seamless. There was no, I don't know, there was no hiccups along the way. There was no disconnection. It just was seamless, and it was totally original. It had a great balance of, like, the writing was is incredible, really, really great. I love how it does have a little bit of a topical or somewhat social political kind of look at how we are now as a society, but it's not ever preachy or heavy handed about, like, and it kind of deals a little bit with the gluttonous kind of culture that we live in, and the use of resources, um, the pharmaceutical companies, really great. But he doesn't do it in a way of where it's ever preachy. It's just very current, and it just gives it an extra. You get an extra sense, or for me, it provides another layer of where it resonates even more. And but the writing is just fantastic. The cast is really top notch. Just really, really, really impressive. Really impressive. I was kind of taken aback by how great the writing was. The cast, again, like I said, is fabulous. Kate Segal, Ruth Codd, Carla Cugini, Bruce Greenwood, who is a really great character actor. I've seen him in a lot of films over the years, and I've seen him in some more recent films, and he is the lead role in this, and he's incredible. He plays this really kind of complex, sinister, you know, he's the main lead, and he is so good. He's just great. He's got all these different shades, and it's really true. I think this story is really true to the source material, but again, it's told in a very modern, from a modern perspective, and again, it's a great balance because it goes into like those kind of the socio political places that we're the place that we're in now and as a society and how fucked up things are. But he never does it in a way of where it's never done in a way of where it's preachy or it's heavy handed. One movie I think which I thought was really good, but I thought it crossed for me a little bit of a line of where I felt like I was being to a degree like made, even though I agree with the premise of the story, but I don't need to be kind of hit over the head with the agenda of the film. And when the agenda is so obvious, when it's about like something, about the environmental issues, a movie that came out, Don't Look Up, with Leonardo DiCaprio, really great movie, and I recommend it. But the thing for me was that it was too much with instead of the story just telling the story and maybe letting it breathe a little bit to where it's not overtly kind of hitting you over the head where you're feeling like, well, I have to agree with this, even, and this is what it is. This is the truth. This is the truth. This is the truth, and you're kind of being, hit over the head with it, and it's a little bit too heavy-handed for me. Even though that being said, I completely agree with the political stance that film has to offer. I think it totally represents where we are as a culture, but it was too much. Whereas I feel the Fall of the House of Usher does very much have this very contemporary look and holds a mirror to where we are as a society, to all of these incredibly complex things that we're going through. But it never, I feel like, I never felt I was getting hit over the head or being ever told that I need to believe a certain way. It was done so well. And again, that's testimony to Mike Flanagan, his talent as a director and a writer, and just meticulous detail. The writing is impeccable. The direction is great. The elements of horror in this are really great, especially the Mask of the Red Death. It's kind of a shocking ending. I didn't really expect it to end that way. And watching it, I was not sure if this is what they were going to be doing, and then it was. It was like this modern version of the Mask of the Red Death, and it was amazing. It was so great, and it was a really cool like critique. Again, a great balance. It was a really cool kind of critique, critical lens being used to look at, what a bunch of dicks we are as a species right now, and the shit storm that we've created. And I just thought it was so cool, so well handed, so delicate but strong and thought provoking, and at the same time great fucking horror. It was really great and great balance. And I think, Mike Flanagan's one of the only guys, if not the only guy, that can do that and really strike that chord, strike that balance. Yeah. And this is a series, and I, obviously didn't see the whole series, but that all being said, it would be cool if, because I know a lot of directors are doing this whole thing of where they've almost kind of to a degree transitioned out of being a director in a way of where their films are theatrically released in theaters. Now they've become more of these directors for these various networks, streaming companies. And, like this is an example I mean, basically everything I've seen Mike Flanagan do is just really awesome. And again, he's one of my favorite guys around. But I also, I hope he gets to go back, and I hope he makes more regular theatrical movies that you can go and see in the theater. Because, again, my issue with watching it last night, my friend Emmett's got a really nice television. He's got a pretty nice system. We watched it through the Netflix account, his Netflix account. And again, it's one of my big grievances with watching movies streaming. I just like there are scenes in the film where it's dark and you almost can't see what's going on, and the sound just feels really compressed. It doesn't feel, there's no like wetness, there's no dynamic range. But mostly again, it's the however the compression is used, there's scenes in the film or the series where it's really dark and it's almost too dark to where you can't see what's going on, and the depth is kind of off. Your depth perception because of that. You don't get that when you watch something on Blu-ray or 4K, or if you go to see it in the theater. You don't get that. You see the perfect balance from a technological standpoint, in a visual sense. But that's just me. And so, but very, very cool series. I definitely recommend it. Mike Flanagan's the man. I think he's the best guy around right now as far as new shows. Another director that just actually released a movie that is, I think, going to be in theaters, but not a whole lot, is David Fincher. David Fincher is one of my favorite directors, but he's also been one of those guys that has kind of transitioned into making movies for these companies. And the last film that he put out in the theater, the last film that I saw of his that I really loved in the theater was Gone Girl, which is an awesome movie. And I just recently bought that on Blu-ray. But now his newer movie with Michael Fassbender, The Killer, I think is going to be in theaters, but it's going to be a limited release. But I hope that he goes back to it as well, and especially Mike Flanagan. It would be great to see them put out full-on theatrical releases again and not just do these series, because it's great, but their forte, first and foremost for me, is just being incredible directors. And so it's a little bit disappointing in that regard that this seems to be the path that they're on, but still quality, especially this series. So, but this is Jason Dean, so I can't recommend the Fall of the House of Usher enough. It's pretty fantastic, and Michael Flanagan's the man. So, thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.